Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on Forgotten Weapons. I'm Ian McCollum, and as usual, our Q&A video today is sponsored by Kiro, the Finnish distillery that makes a truly fantastic Finnish rye. And if you haven't tried this, worth checking it out at your local liquor store. Their distribution is expanding in the US, which is pretty exciting. You can also order it online through their website at Kiro Distillery. Wait, I should leave that out, shouldn't I? KiroDistillery.com. And in fact, if you do that in the US, Germany, or Finland, you can use the code ForgottenMalt10 to get yourself 10% off your order and also help contribute to Forgotten Weapons. So give it a try if you haven't tried it before. It is a fantastic malt rye whiskey. Alrighty, and our questions, of course, come from the Forgotten Weapons patrons. I put up a post on Patreon about a week ago asking for questions, as I always do when we are setting up to do a monthly Q&A. So let's dig into them. Our first one comes from Leon. It says, can you think of any major rifles or ideas that arrived a generation too early, a system limited by the metallurgy or the powder of the era? I've got two good answers to that. Well, I think they're good. One of them is, I think, what Leon is probably expecting, and the other is maybe something he didn't think about, that being every self-loading firearm ever before 1886. During the black powder era, there were a bunch of people who were trying to develop self-loading firearms, whether that be semi-automatic or machine guns. The Mannlicher 1885 is a good example. Maxim was particularly talented and was able to actually create a machine gun using black powder. Now, he was very lucky that right about the time that the Maxim gun got out of the really early prototype stages, smokeless powder was developed, and he was able to transition that thing to smokeless powder, where it worked fantastically well. How successful it would have been on black powder is up for interpretation, but none of the answers are going to be nearly as good as it was on smokeless powder. So every single one of these efforts before 1886, trying to make something self-loading, suffered from this inescapable problem of black powder leaving a tremendous amount of fouling and residue behind it. And trying to do high rates of fire with mechanical parts that are moving, that have to have relatively close clearances for things to work right, those are going to get immediately filled up with powder fouling from black powder and cause huge problems. Revolvers of that era had issues with powder fouling, jamming cylinders. Imagine how bad it would be for a machine gun. So that's the whole class of guns that fit this criteria. But I think maybe Leon was thinking about something that was a little more just too far-fetched for its time. And the best example I can think of that is actually the Winchester Lee Navy, which was, it's not so much the rifle, it is the cartridge, which was a high-velocity, small bore. It was a 6mm cartridge using early smokeless powder, and it suffered from problems of throat erosion. The powder was too hot, and it just didn't have the barrel lifespan that it needed to really be a successful rifle and cartridge combination. And that's one of those things where obviously we can do 6mm cartridges today without too much problem. We have better barrel steels, we have better powder formulations. That's a rifle that in theory, maybe, I mean, there were other issues with it. The Army being maybe not so much interested in a small bore cartridge at the time, but that's a rifle that could have been a lot better had it been a generation later. Next question is from William, who says, what is your opinion on the new DETAC, D-E-T-A-C, Arms shotgun shell 12-gauge auto, a rimless 12-gauge designed to feed better from magazines? Do you think this has a place in the market, or will it be another 30 super carry? Just as an aside to start, at SHOT Show this past year, so like 6 months ago, I actually stopped in and I asked the guys at Federal about 30 super carry, and they claim it's actually still selling really quite well. So I'm a bit disappointed we haven't seen any new pistols come out chambered for it, but that cartridge apparently is not dead. They're still making a lot of it. Anyway, 12-gauge rimless auto shotgun shells. My initial answer, because when I read this question, I hadn't heard of the shotgun, didn't know anything about it, and my immediate reaction was, well, that's going to go nowhere extremely quickly. But then I took a look at it, and it may actually have a place in the market. It may be at exactly the right place at the right time. So traditionally, we've had box magazine fed shotguns for a while now, and there's always talk about, if only we could get rid of this stupid rim on the shotgun shells, these box magazines would work so much more easily. Why don't we do that? The rim's obsolete. Well, the rim's not really obsolete. The rim is a very helpful tool for running shotgun shells in tube magazines, which is where they're usually used historically and still today. The problem with introducing a better design of shot shell is it's a brand new cartridge. You don't get any of the interchangeability with regular 12 gauge ammunition. People like a 12 gauge in part because they can go down to any store anywhere and get 12 gauge ammunition, and it will just work in their gun, unless maybe they have a poorly made box magazine for it. If you're making a rimless 12 gauge, it might as well be, a rimless 13.4 gauge or any other totally different cartridge, because you're not going to be able to just go get ammo for it at any store and use it. And so for that reason, it's never been worth the squeeze to make a new 12 gauge just for box magazines with all the compatibility that you have to give up. However, I noticed that DETAC Arms is the big thing on their website right now is to come look at them at the next Special Operations trade show. And they're marketing this as an anti-drone weapon in particular. And that might be exactly the one niche spot and time period where a gun like this could actually get itself purchased and put into production. And that's because as a last-ditch close combat drone anti-drone tool, the shotgun certainly is in its prime right now. Like, it's got a glorious peak of interest right now, and we'll see how long it lasts. It could stick around. I suspect shotguns are not a great tool for this. They're better than, they're the worst tool we have for it, except for all the other ones. So I suspect there will be a lot of development in electronic warfare systems and other counter-drone technologies that are going to be a little more dependable and have a little more standoff range than a 12 gauge shotgun. But for the time being, there is a lot of interest in the shotgun option. And for a military sort of contract that, Special Forces doesn't need to be able to go into Walmart to get ammo for their 12 gauge drone shotguns. And they potentially have the money to spend on a boutique specialty new tool using its own custom ammunition. They're going to want, even if they use regular traditional 12 gauge, they're going to want a special loading of it to maximize the potential effect on drones as a target. And so why not buy something that uses a special new rimless 12 gauge for that specific purpose? This isn't a gun that's going to become, I do not see this being popular with the civilian market because of the lack of ammunition compatibility. But for a military contract, this might be the one time it could work. I have to say, I don't know anything about the gun itself. I assume it runs fine, but yeah, I don't know. One of the problems with semi-auto 12 gauge shotguns is there is a massive scale of ammunition loadings in 12 gauge. From, at the very low end, you've got beanbag rounds and other low power, less lethal ammunition, all the way up to things like 3.5-inch Magnum, Thor's hammer turkey hunting loads, and everything in between. And semi-auto shotgun manufacturers have to come up with some way to either devise a very clever operating system that can handle this whole range of ammunition, or else decide what specific bits of ammo their gun is going to be able to cycle reliably, and then communicate that effectively to their customers, who are then theoretically willing to accept it. If you have a drone defense shotgun like this, it's going to have a specialty ammo, and you're going to be able, as the maker, you're going to be able to design it to run that ammunition specifically, which relieves a lot of the problems of semi-auto shotgun design. So this might work. We'll have to just keep an eye out and see. All right, our next question comes from Brian, who says, I really liked the What Would Stoner Do? Would you ever consider doing a What Would Jeff Cooper Do? A modern take on the Scout rifle. Well, no, because I think someone already has. And when I did a video on this rifle, I described it as, in my opinion, the modern incarnation of the Scout rifle, and that is the Q-Fix. I know this can be a controversial rifle to a lot of people, but this, to me, kind of does everything that the Scout rifle was originally intended to do in a platform that takes advantage of some more modern things that Cooper didn't really, that weren't on the mind of the consumers in Cooper's era. And a large part of that is the suppressor. I think for hunting, a suppressor is an absolutely fantastic, if not essential idea. I really like the idea of a large bore subsonic hunting cartridge that can expand substantially and can retain a lot of terminal effect, even though it stays subsonic. The Fix and 8.6 Blackout are a good option for that. They're not the only option, but what I know people are going to say, like, there's 338 Federal and there's 458 Raptor, 450 the 45 caliber cartridges, the really big stuff, even bigger than 338. What about those 375s? And my answer to that is, if we look at this from a Scout rifle perspective, one of the things that Cooper wanted to do with the Scout rifle was maintain some level of sort of military compatibility with the gun, which is why he had things like stripper clip loading as a core component, or detachable box magazines. Well, the Fix does that too. The thing about 8.6 Blackout is that it is specifically designed so that it will stack and operate just fine in 308 AR-10 magazines. And that's something that none of its competitor cartridges can do. So, you get your 375 Raptor, that's going to be a small internal magazine. You're not using stripper clips on it. You're not using detachable box magazines. Or if you are, they're, very expensive single stack style of mags. The Fix sort of has that little bit of military pseudo compatibility to it, that I think put it pretty closely into the Scout rifle range. It's a gun that is, because thanks to its short barrel, again, something that wasn't really wasn't really visible, wasn't interesting to people in Cooper's time. You can have a very short barrel, folding stock. It becomes a very lightweight and compact platform while maintaining a terminal effectiveness to engage large game. I shot an elk with that Q-Fix, and I'm very happy with it, and it tasted fantastic. You don't need a Scout scope on it because you have a detachable box magazine on the bottom. You can outfit it with the scope of your choice. For what it's worth, I have this ginormous thing on here because it is a Burris Eliminator that has a built-in laser rangefinder, which is essential to be able to make decent hits at anything past 150 yards, 200 yards with a subsonic cartridge that has a trajectory like a brick thrown out of a window. But you get a scope like that that can give you your exact range and your holdover, and I think it becomes a very interesting potential hunting rifle. So to me, that's the modern What Would Cooper Do? Next up is Ron, who says, what are your thoughts about P7 Pro making new P7 M8 pistols and a new P7 M13 Slim? I'm pretty excited about it. I've talked to the gentleman behind the company. I am getting one of them myself, one of the P7 M13 Slim lines. He is very knowledgeable, very passionate on the subject. It's taking some time, but I think that is because he's trying to do things properly and effectively, and not just try and slam a couple of prototypes out the door and then have trouble catching up and have reliability issues. I'm perfectly willing to be very patient for that project to mature at the appropriate pace. And yeah, I'm very excited to have one and to get one. I have always liked the P7 pistol. The thing I didn't like about the M13 is it was just too big of a grip. And he has come up with a redesign of the magazine that slims down the grip quite a lot, which is, I think, a pretty exciting thing. Is that going to be a wildly popular pistol with everybody? No, it's definitely not. I think the price is going to be quite high. These are going to be low production, semi-boutique pistols. But for the the connoisseur who really likes the P7 and really wishes they hadn't gone out of production and maybe really wants to get one with an optics cut or wants to have one with a longer barrel. P7 Pro is a really exciting thing. So I look forward to seeing them finish that project and come out. And I'll definitely have some videos on that pistol when it is available. Land Cruiser says, to your knowledge, has any military issue Mauser rifle, 93, 95, 98, come with an aperture rear sight? And I was going to say, no, not to my knowledge, although there are some guns similar that have. The Madsen had a rear aperture sight, Type 99 Arisakas, well, many of the, some Arisakas had notch sights, some Arisakas had aperture sights on them. But then I actually happened to be browsing through Anthony van der Linden's book on FN Mauser rifles and noticed that I believe it was the Haitian contract. They specifically made a custom rear sight for, what would it be, like FN Model 30 Mausers for Haiti after World War II that used an aperture rear sight specifically to pseudo-duplicate the sight picture on an M1 Garand, which Haiti also had in its inventory at the time. So yes, there actually have been aperture rear sight Mausers. Michael says, if NATO had adopted an intermediate rifle cartridge instead of the 308, what would it most likely have been? What would have been the best? What would have made people the least angry? Honestly, the only real way I can see that project developing would have been from a basis of the 30 carbine cartridge. So the 308 Winchester, the 7.62 NATO, developed off of the 300 Savage case and kind of took that and made it a little bit bigger. I think if NATO had wanted to go with an intermediate caliber cartridge, 30 carbine would have been the natural starting point. M1 carbines were very popular firearms with the US military. They became very popular throughout NATO and beyond NATO after World War II. We gave away a lot of M1 carbines as military surplus, and we can actually see a number of countries iterating on the 30 carbine cartridge in the 1950s. So Beretta did it. They developed the Beretta Model 57, which was a select fire box magazine fed intermediate caliber carbine. It was essentially an assault rifle in 30 carbine in the 1950s. The Dominican Republic obviously did it with the San Cristobal carbine, but that gun didn't have as much international influence as the Beretta did. And then the French also did a lot of experimentation with the 30 carbine cartridge. They went so far as to also develop their own domestic, well, they called it a 7.65 cartridge, 7.65 by, I believe it was 35 millimeter. Think of it as largely a slightly Frenchified Spitzer 30 carbine. So these developments did take place. None of them ended up getting adopted in large scale, aside from the use of free surplus M1 carbines. But that's where I would see this project developing. As an interesting aside, we can also look at the 22 Spitfire case developed by Johnson, which takes 30 carbine and necks it down to 22. If you want to look at an alternate road to a 5.56 or to a, it's more powerful than a 5.7 by 28, but you want an alternate road to that style of small bore intermediate cartridge like the 5.45 or the 5.56, well, there it is. You can take 30 carbine and neck it down. That's where I see this would have come from. But of course, there are major institutional hurdles to something like this being adopted as a standard infantry rifle. Even when people think about, there's a lot of I think misunderstanding that the British wanted a true intermediate cartridge. Well, they didn't. The British wanted a slightly lower powered rifle cartridge. The original British 270 and 280 cartridges are not, they're not 30 carbine, they're not 8mm Kurtz. They're rifle caliber, but a little bit lighter. I don't think anyone in NATO, aside from perhaps the French, gave much serious consideration to a truly intermediate caliber cartridge after World War II. Next up is Alex, who says, if you had to choose one of the PM63 Rock, the Stechkin, or the VZ61 Scorpion to take into combat, which would you pick and why? That is an interesting, somewhat difficult question. So off the bat, I would first eliminate the Stechkin. To me, the Stechkin is just a machine pistol. The stock setup for it is pretty much an afterthought. I've shot Stechkins. As a pistol, I don't find them particularly controllable. As a pistol, I would leave the Stechkin on semi-auto and just use it as a large capacity, chunky 9x18 caliber semi-auto pistol. Then you get the PM63, which is really much more of a very compact submachine gun and works fairly nicely in that role. The idea of the slide coming right up back to your eye is a little disconcerting. That's kind of the big downside to that gun, but it is compact enough to carry in the thigh holster, in a leg holster, belt holster. Good use of magazines. It's got a nice vertical front grip on it. It's a pretty darn good gun in a reasonable caliber, 9x18 Makarov again. The Scorpion is similar. It's not quite as ergonomic. The stock is, I mean, the PM63 stock isn't anything to really write home about, but the Scorpion stock is less so. It's usable, but it's quite short and it's very small. But the 32 ACP caliber of the Scorpion makes it even more controllable. It's a very pleasant, very easy gun to shoot. And so to me, it's a difficult choice of, do I want the little bit of extra controllability and handling of the PM63, or do I want a little bit more handiness and concealability of the VZ61? If it came to owning one of them, I would rather own a real Scorpion, because that's a really interesting, neat gun, I think, that's a bit more different than to other things than the PM63 is. If I had to take one into combat, it's a difficult choice. I do not have any combat experience, and so my choice on that is going to have to be with a big grain of salt. I think if you forced me to pick one, I would say the PM63. All right, our next question is from Arthur. It says, we often hear that due to limitations in metallurgy, firearms from the early 20th century are weaker, and some of them are recommended for use with reduced power loads to prevent damage or danger. When it comes to determining the strength of an action, how much of a role does metallurgy play? Are there any older firearm designs that would be perfectly adequate if they had access to modern metallurgy? The sort of pedantic answer is, if you could had infinitely strong metal, every single design would work just fine. So the question then becomes, well, okay, which ones would work with current metals but not 1890s metals? And the problem with doing this is you've got a combination of the amount of metal and the chemical, or the composition, the alloying, the strength of that metal. The weaker it is, the more of it you need to be able to achieve the same overall capability. And when you're talking about guns from the black powder era, and that's really what separates these two. This isn't like this sliding scale of guns getting stronger. It's really, there's a little bit of that, but it's primarily weak guns until smokeless powder, and then boop, graph goes up and you have strong guns. And the reason for that is smokeless powder operates at significantly, like multiple times, higher pressures than black powder does. And so the guns using smokeless powder had to have stronger actions. With a gun designed for a black powder cartridge, you'd take your metallurgy and you just design the parts to meet the required strength. Anything above that, like proactively designing a black powder rifle to work with a theoretical future smokeless cartridge, is a huge waste of time and money. Like, you're spending a lot of money to make this gun 3 times stronger than it's ever actually going to need to be. And so that's why people didn't do it. So most of the time, I suspect the black powder cartridges, or the black powder actions, need more reinforcement than you would get with just making them out of a modern steel, because they were made to such a lower pressure standard, because that's what was normal. That's what black powder actually produces. And that's why you will see a lot of things with single locking lugs. You know, the many black powder bolt action rifles where the only locking lug is just the root of the bolt handle against the back of the receiver. That was perfectly adequate for black powder, But even if you make that out of modern materials, it's still a little sketchy, perhaps, for smokeless powder modern ammunition. So I don't think there's that much out there that you could just rebuild with today's steel without having to redesign the action a little bit as well. Oh, and he tangentially adds, what would stop someone from making in 1873 in 454 Kasul? The pressure standard for Kasul is not that big, not that much more than 357 Magnum. Well, the answer is nothing would stop someone from doing that. In fact, Freedom Arms does it. Freedom Arms will make you essentially a single action army in 455 Kasul, or a number of other really monstrous cartridges in that same sort of area. Steven says, are you aware of any company working on a US-made FAMAS clone or reproduction? Yes, I am. Childers Guns, who you may know better for their AK receivers. They are well into the process of making new semi-auto FAMAS receivers. They started out doing this for the FAMAS Feline parts kits. That's the modernized, sort of more optics-ready version of the FAMAS. A pretty darn small number of those parts kits came into the US at really exorbitant, eye-watering prices, thousands and thousands of dollars for kits. But there were a batch of them that came in, and I suspect that in addition to being able to make receivers for the people who bought those kits are going to be able to afford a fairly expensive semi-auto receiver and are definitely going to be interested in it. I suspect Childers is also hedging their bets on the idea that we will get some regular FAMAS F1 parts kits in at some point, which, I don't know, is seeming more likely. I don't have any particular insight into that. I'm not aware of any kits that are specifically coming in, but it wouldn't surprise me if they do from somewhere. At this point, we've seen a lot of interesting, neat stuff come in, and someone's going to find a batch of FAMASs, even if it's, even if it's only 100 guns that come in as parts kits. That's a lot of semi-auto receivers. And anyway, that's speculative. What is not speculative is Childers is making it. As you might suspect, I did pony up to get one of those kits, and I will be getting a receiver and a build from Childers. So I will have a full video on that when it's actually available as well, which hopefully is not more than a few months away at this point. It's exciting. M. Welty says, what firearm has the longest or most convoluted path from the magazine feed lips to the chamber? Interesting question. Longest is probably going to be one of the Maxim style machine guns, because those things pull cartridges out the back of the belt and then run them down and then forward and then into the barrel. And it's actually, you're talking maybe a foot of total travel of that cartridge before it actually gets into the chamber, between the travel going back and then the travel going forward again. They're pretty well secured. Obviously, Maxim guns work nice and reliably. It's not a wonky, very strange system, but it is one that has a very long amount of travel from the feed to the chamber. The guns that are kind of weirder would be some of the non-belt feds that pull cartridges backwards. So the Boberg and the Mars pistols have a reverse feed where they pull around out of the magazine. The Mars pistol in particular does this in a rather weird way, where it actually pulls the cartridge out and just hangs it off the back of the gun on the outside above the hammer, deliberately with enough dwell time in it so that the cartridge will stop flapping up and down, so that it'll come to an equilibrium and feed reliably into the chamber. The other contender, kudos to the fellow on Patreon who suggested this one, you're not wrong, would be the Landstad revolver, which is a one-off Norwegian prototype that is a magazine-fed revolver, where you actually have a box magazine in the grip, and the cartridge is fed from the box magazine into the bottom chamber of a two-chamber cylinder. And then when operating the gun, the cylinder then rotates 180 degrees, which brings the cartridge up to the top, where it is then fired. That's a pretty goofy feed layout. Runner-up might be the Trowns, the Dardek revolvers. But honestly, those aren't that weird. It's kind of the same thing. You've got a magazine feeding into a cylinder that then rotates up. Actually a little bit less weird than the Landstad, I would say. Dave JD says, for a time, Japan adopted and used two different versions of 7.62x51, a reduced recoil loading for the Type 64 rifle and a full power loading for machine guns. The reduced recoil load is distinguishable by having a purple or violet painted bullet tip. It is not truly an assault rifle cartridge. The Japanese Self-Defense Force decision seems like an interesting alternative to using two entirely different cartridges like 5.56 and 7.62. Do you know if they came to regret this choice, and what is your opinion of the concept? I have no idea what the opinion of this was within the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. Unfortunately, I don't have any experience with a 64. I've never handled one. I don't know anybody who's got a lot of experience with them. If you do, and it's entirely plausible these days, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear some firsthand feedback on the Type 64. Now, to clear some things up, yes, it's like a 20% reduced velocity. The Japanese 7.62 NATO rifle loading is a 139 grain bullet at about 2,350 feet per second. So it's not quite like M43 7.62x39 loading, but it's kind of close. It's a little heavier bullet at about the same velocity. And the guns were perfectly capable of running standard 7.62 NATO. They had an adjustable gas port, and in order to run full power NATO ammo, you would switch the gas port to a reduced setting, so it had less gas. Bolt velocity was reduced, and you'd have more recoil, of course, but the guns would work fine. This isn't an issue where they were designed only for a light loading, and using real NATO ammo would cause damage. And as I understand it, they always used the full power ammo in the machine guns, where recoil was less of an issue because it's a machine gun on a tripod or on a mount. It's an interesting theory. It's, again, kind of like the second question today. My initial reaction is like, that's a really bad idea. They're going to get mixed up and it's going to be a disaster. But maybe not. Especially depending on how you do the logistics. If you're packaging your machine gun ammo in belts and you're packaging your rifle ammo in plain boxes or something, they do have the painted bullet tip. Definitely having a lighter power cartridge for the rifles is a good idea. They're going to be more shootable and more controllable in a reduced power cartridge. I would certainly prefer to use that cartridge myself, and the idea that it is just a gas position flip away from being able to use anything. If some big war did break out and Japan needed to make use of NATO stockpiles of ammunition, they could have pretty easily. So I'm tempted to say it's not a bad alternative. It's not a bad idea. Like I said, though, I don't have any direct insight into this, so I would love to hear from someone who had some experience with it. Maybe there are some elements of this that I'm not thinking through, or some that have more significant impacts than I'm giving them credit for. Paul says, in the history and development of the Kalashnikov AK, originally having a stamped receiver, there are beliefs and rumors of whether captured German engineers helped the Soviets to design, to standardize, to improve their stamping technology. In your opinion, do you think Germans actually helped the Soviets with complex stamping, or did the Soviets figure it out on themselves? I am going to lean towards they did not have German assistance on this. I think our expectations in the West on this are a little bit clouded by the fact that a lot of Western countries were very happy to absorb German science and engineering experts. Obviously the classic one is rocketry. In the United States, we had Operation Paperclip. We grabbed all sorts of German scientists and engineers and exploited them to the best that we possibly could. I think in the Soviet Union, there was a little bit of a different attitude, that anyone who came out of Germany was very suspect. This is a country that was still being run by Stalin, like very much run by Stalin. And not only are German scientists philosophically suspect, but they're also, it's embarrassing. Like, we believe that our country has everything we need to develop all of our own weapons and they'll be better than the German stuff. And can you imagine how humiliating it would need to be to actually have Germans help us figure out how to make our own guns work? the Russians that I have talked to, Max Popyenko in particular, is pretty adamant that the Soviet Union did not make use of German engineers for what were at the time the high priority, top secret, most important weapons projects. They absolutely tried to exploit their knowledge and their skills, but they did so in areas that were a lot less sensitive than developing the new standard issue rifle for the Red Army. So there's also an interesting point to be made that if they did have German engineers who had presumably already figured this stuff out pretty well themselves with guns like the Sturmgewehr, if they did have those guys helping them, why did it take so long? Like if they used German engineers to figure this out, they should have been able to do it a good deal faster than they actually did. You put all of these factors together, and I think the balance of the evidence suggests that they were not used. Unlike here in the West, where, I mean, you know, you've got the guys from Mauser who come over and create HK by way of France, where they were very much exploited for their skills, although the rifles they developed didn't end up being adopted by the French. And then the Spanish, who were equally happy to make use of them for a brand new, high-tech, cutting-edge, modern Spanish rifle. I think there's just a difference in political attitude as to whether that is something that a country is willing to do between Western Europe and the Soviet Union. Paul, I think this is a different Paul, says, in the personal opinion of our friend Chris Bartacci of Small Arms Solution, the cartridge the US military should use in place of the standard 5.56 is the 7.8 SPC. Thinks it would be the ideal cartridge because it's a little bit larger and still allows the same combat load as the 5.56. How does the 6.8 SPC compare to the 6.8 Fury that's used in the SIG M7 in terms of performance and combat load? I included this question because I see a lot of what appears to be a misunderstanding of a simplification of the new US Army's 6.8 cartridge. It's 6.8 by 51. But it is such a fundamentally different cartridge than all of the other 6.5s and 6.8s that are out there. People look at it and they're like, well, why did we do that 6.8? We already have like 3 other 6.8 cartridges. You know, the 6.8 SPC. Let's just use that, and then we don't have to buy all these new rifles and we get lots of additional ammo capacity. The difference with the 6.8 Fury, 6.8 by 51, 277 Fury, all different names for the same cartridge, is that it operates at a ridiculously high pressure. That thing's operating at like 80,000 KSI, or 80,000 PSI, and it requires a rifle that's specifically designed to handle that pressure. You cannot just convert an AR-10, like you can't just rechamber an AR-10 for 6.8 by 51 and not expect it to like break a lot of components really fast because of the much higher pressure and the higher bolt velocity that it's going to experience as a result. So as I see it, like 6.8 by 51 is in a category entirely by itself. It represents a specific set of decisions that the military wants to get 3,300, give or take, feet per second of muzzle velocity out of a 13-inch barrel. Like more muzzle velocity than the M16, using a bullet that is, I believe it's 130 grain bullet. So we're talking more than double the weight of a 5.56 bullet, going faster out of a barrel that is 60% the length. So this is a huge engineering challenge, and that short barrel exists so that we can put a suppressor on it and still have a short overall length. But so the gun has to be this compromise of factors in order. How do you get a short overall length with a suppressor, but still having a high enough muzzle velocity to defeat really high-tech modern armor? The answer is the only one of these little levers that you can shift that you haven't already set in position is take the chamber pressure and crank it up. And that's what allows you to get more muzzle velocity out of a short barrel to accomplish this end goal. Now, in order to get that muzzle velocity, you need high chamber pressure. You also need a relatively large cartridge. You're not doing this with a 5.56 case volume. You need essentially a 7.62 NATO case volume to do it. And so that's why you end up with 20 round magazines. In theory, they might be able to make a 25 round mag for it. There are questions of how long do you want the magazine to physically be. but basically, it's once you make this series of decisions, you are locked into a large diameter case, which means you're reducing the ammunition carrying capacity of magazines and in turn soldiers by about 50%. Your combat load for 7 mags goes from 210 rounds to 140 rounds. It's really substantial. And in theory, you're doing this because the trade-off is worth it. Being able to defeat that body armor is worth all of these other trade-offs of barrel life and rifle longevity and rifle cost and ammunition complexity. Manufacturing this ammo is proving to be extremely challenging, and we haven't figured out how to do it at scale yet. The plain brass ammo is fine. The hybrid case with the steel case head with the brass body, as I understand it, is working decently well for normal pressure cartridges, but the whole point of this, the go-to-war ammo that's super high pressure, is still causing huge problems in manufacturability. And I'm afraid we're going to end up in a position where people decide it's not worth it. We can't manage to do it effectively, and so we'll just use the ammo that does work, at which point you've made all of these sacrifices in the rifle and the loadout in exchange for essentially nothing, in exchange for what you could have had with a good 5.56 NATO armor-piercing round. I'm afraid that's where we're going. I will not be surprised if that's where we end up, and that'll be a real bummer. Now, do I think that we should have done 6.8 SPC instead? No, but I'm not willing to get in fights over it. To me, 6.8 SPC has more terminal impact on target. It's got more power. As a result, it doesn't shoot quite as flat. Your muzzle velocity is a little bit lower. And that's fine. I think either that or 5.56 would be a perfectly adequate rifle. The margin of difference between them is not very substantial. And then when you what happens is when you throw in the added cost of changing from one caliber to another. Let's say we don't even need new magazines. We can keep the mags, but we have to change over our ammunition. Now we no longer have ammo compatibility with the M249s. We need to rechamber our light machine guns. We need new training. We need new dummy rounds. We need new proof rounds. There's a lot of logistical expense that goes into changing calibers. We have to rebarrel how many hundreds of thousands of rifles. I don't think the juice from that is worth the squeeze of the cost of doing it. But if the Army decided to do it, to me, okay, I think it's an inefficient use of money, but it's not going to cause any problems. Compare that to the decision to adopt 6.8 by 51, which I think is both an incredibly expensive boondoggle and one that's going to result in significant degradation of infantry capability in those areas where it really matters. On paper, it sounds like it gives all sorts of great advantages. I don't think most of those are either actually important in the real world or perhaps going to actually be implemented in the real world. And that's my problem with 6.8 by 51. Ooh, all right. Rick says, I'm looking to get back into the AR game and things have changed a lot since the 1980s. Yes, they have. In your opinion, what are the pros and cons of rear/side/ambi-side/forward charging? In my experience, all of my previous experience was on the M16A1 and M16A4 military pattern rifles. I'm just going to be plinking and shooting at the range. I would say get a standard, traditional AR operating system. I don't think the various changed versions, the side chargers and such, I don't think they're that relevant. If there was a very specific reason that you wanted one and it made sense to you, great, do it. But if you're asking me this question, it means you're familiar with the way the M16 originally worked with that T charging handle. Just go ahead and use it. There is nothing wrong with it. There are pros and cons to it, but there's nothing fundamentally bad about it. And just go with it. It works. Don't fix it. All right, our next question comes from Thomas, who says, can you explain the purpose of the squared front trigger guards on Glock pistols, as well as Smith & Wessons, and I'll add a lot of other modern pistols? I've never figured out how to use them, especially without radically altering my normal two-handed grip. It seems to me this was a fad from about 30 years ago that was short-lived. I tend to agree. You don't see a lot of people, especially professionals, using this support hand trigger finger hooked around the front of the trigger guard to help stabilize the gun. But there are a number of ancillary other benefits that you get from having that geometry that probably explain why it's still there. So first off, it doesn't actually cause any problems. If you're not using it, it doesn't inhibit any other modern pistol shooting grips. Secondly, by having the front of the trigger guard kind of squared out and relatively large, it is a natural way to have a little more space in the front of the trigger guard, which is useful if you want to be able to accommodate gloves, which is a relevant thing in a lot of places. It also, I've seen some people talk about using it as a barricade rest, being able to press the gun up against a barricade using that flat front of the trigger guard. Like, I don't see that being useful all that often, but if it doesn't cause any problems, then kind of like, why not? And I think fundamentally that's the thing. It was developed when it was a popular shooting trend. And even though that went away, there isn't a lot of really important, like there aren't any really good reasons to get rid of it. It doesn't hurt anything. So I think a lot of companies just leave it there. In addition, it's probably not trivial that it looks tactical. And to a lot of people who are not serious shooters, they may look at that and they're like, oh, that one's got the extra checkering and like the flat, like, oh, that's definitely the better model, obviously, because it's more tactical. So probably helps sales a bit on that front. SB says, what friendly nation has been the hardest to gain access to their firearms collections and museums? That is an interesting question. It's a little bit less about nationality and more about who owns the collection. So in general, private collections are by far the easiest to get into because most major private collectors at this point know who I am and they enjoy having me come visit and film some of their guns, and it's cool and it's fun, and that's been very easy. Fundamentally, the more people involved in a decision-making loop, the more difficult it is for me to get access to a place. So with a private collection, you got one guy. Like, who owns it? If he thinks that's a cool idea, then done, you're in. There are a number of relatively small museums, and I find this especially in smaller countries, where there's a much shorter chain of command, so to speak. The administration of a museum in a very small country is going to have fewer people. They're often going to be excited about having attention from a large, like an English language channel or media source interested in their small country that normally doesn't get a lot of attention. And so I have often I've had extremely hospitable welcomes from a lot of small countries in that way. But even then, if it's a private collector, it's super easy. If it's a small museum, it's fairly easy usually. If it's the military, things are the hardest. Because in the military, there is a lot of potential liability. No one wants to get in trouble, so they bump things up to the next layer of the chain of command. And I may end up in a position where I have to, someone has to convince some colonel who doesn't know anything about what I do that it's a good idea to let this foreigner wander around our military installation and play with the guns. And that's the most challenging part. It's less about whether that's in Germany or the United States or France or Estonia than it is about whether this is a full-on military facility versus a museum versus a collection. So yeah, that's the difference. It's not so much nationality. All right, next question is from Taylor. Says, with the $200 tax going away for suppressors, do you feel like there will be a new niche for collecting vintage or older suppressors? I think this may be of interest to guys who do clone builds of various older guns. Yeah, it absolutely would, but I don't think there's going to be that much of a market for it. Not because people aren't interested, but because the suppressors just aren't out there. The number of registered suppressors that are older than the 1990s is just pretty skimpy. You talk about stuff from before the NFA, like Maxims, and there were some competitors to Maxims that are really interesting, but very, very few of those actually got registered because that tax was so prohibitively expensive, like deliberately prohibitively expensive at the time. So, no one was almost no one was paying a $200 tax to register a $3 Maxim silencer. And so the suppressors often ended up confiscated over time as they were found by law enforcement or thrown away. Or today, technically speaking, there is no legal way to register and legalize an unregistered old vintage suppressor. I think a lot of people expect that you could just file a Form 1 to manufacture a suppressor and put in all the data from the unregistered suppressor that you have sitting in front of you. And while as a practical matter, it's extremely unlikely that anyone would ever find out and you'd probably be fine, that's not actually technically a legal thing to do. Technically, the only legal way would be to destroy the suppressor and then remanufacture something out of the scrap components from it. I don't think a lot of people are doing that, but like that's the legal standard, and because that is the legal standard, it really limits the number of these things that are actually available on the market. It would be a little different if we had a system where SOTs could take a gun, a black market gun that was unregistered, and just file a form to register it and make it legal. And you'd think that is something that the politicians would want. They want to get the unregistered, untraceable stuff off the street and get it into the system. But that's not how our legal system is set up with regards to the NFA and machine guns and suppressors. So, you know, later on than that, you do get suppressors that are sold onto the civilian market. But they're just, yeah, there has been a market for those being collectible. I don't know that it's going to get much bigger now that the tax is off, maybe a little bit. But yeah, I wish there was more opportunity for vintage suppressors to exist. I have seen some stuff about companies, well, there are some companies that have started making reproductions of vintage suppressors. Limon making the very early CAR 15 moderators is a really good example. I don't remember this. Someone started making a reproduction Maxim suppressor, which looks pretty cool. I haven't actually seen one in person, but I saw some stuff online about them. That's a cool trend. It's not quite as cool as having the real originals, but it is neat still. All right, just a couple more questions here. Jay Long says, Ian, do you think we're on the same topic here, sort of. Do you think the federal government will ever dump the National Firearms Act or just have it overturned in the courts? The original justification for the law is that it was a tax and not a ban. Well, now the tax is $0. ... This, unfortunately, is also exhibits a misunderstanding of the taxation scheme regarding the NFA. The tax that is visible to most people is the transfer tax or the manufacturer tax, $200 to make a suppressor or to transfer one. However, there's another entire layer of taxation involved, and that is the licensing of manufacturers and dealers of NFA weapons. So if you want to make suppressors, not just make one as an individual, but if you want to be in the business of making suppressors, you have to get a special occupation. You are a special occupational taxpayer, and you have to pay a tax and get a special license. That's an SOT. And that is an integral part of the National Firearms Act. And that taxation is also very much involved in the system. If you look at this from the government's perspective, like this is how a court is going to look at this question if it comes up. If you go to the Supreme Court and you say, the tax is $0, therefore the whole scheme is illegal and the NFA is unconstitutional, regardless of whether it's unconstitutional on Second Amendment grounds or not, which it is, the court's going to look at the whole scope and say, but the government has an interest in tracing the ownership and the movement of these dangerous items, and that's why they regulate and license the manufacture of them, and that whole thing is still in operation, is still viable and useful to the government without having a tax on the final end user transfer of the device. So that's, you don't have to agree with this, but that is the element of this that I think people overlook when they assume that because the tax for the user has been reduced to $0, the whole thing is now null and void. Lord Zafar says, what sorts of replica firearms are worth collecting, or do you think a collector should focus only on originals? I was thinking mostly about replicas made during the 20th century. There are a number of replicas that I think are interesting and definitely worth collecting. And the criteria basically is if an original is unavailable, either because they don't physically exist or because they're so rare that they're too expensive to be affordable, but there is a replica available, replicas, I think, are totally legitimate. There's also a fantastic place for replicas as shooting guns. A really good example would be I actually went and bought one of the replica Liberator pistols when they came out many years ago. Not because I couldn't find an original. The originals are 5 times as expensive, but they are out there. Like, it's not that hard to find a Liberator at auction. They come up reasonably often. But I wanted to be able to go shoot a Liberator, and I wanted to be able to have other people who are shooting with me try shooting a Liberator. To me, that's the really interesting thing about that gun. But I was not interested in taking an original Liberator and putting a bunch of ammo through it. To me, a replica fits that need perfectly. And I think it's a great opportunity, a great place to have a replica gun. A lot of black powder revolvers are the same way. All the replica Colts and replica Lamats and all of those guns are a fantastic opportunity to do a lot of practical shooting with a gun that, if it were original, you would have to be a little concerned about the metallurgy and the value and the wear that you're putting on it and the potential of damaging it through use. It is interesting. There are definitely places where faked, not even just replica, but like fraudulent fake guns have become valuable in their own right. Headstamp has a book on Collier revolvers. There are reproduction fake Colliers out there that were made because the originals were so rare and so hard to get, and those fakes have collectible value of their own today. So that's another potentially good place for them. I think in the modern market, another good example would be semi-automatic clones of select fire military rifles and things like AKs, G3s, FALs. There's all sorts of interesting variations on these different patterns that you're never going to get. Like, I'm not going to get an original Venezuelan FAL in my own collection. Like, there aren't any in the United States on the registry, I don't think, or if there are any, it's a tiny number, and I'm never gonna have one of them. But if I can get a parts kit built on a semi-automatic receiver that gives me a reasonable facsimile of that original, in lieu of ever being able to have the original, if that's something that I'm interested in, I think it's absolutely worth collecting. Now, the place where they're less valuable to me, less useful or less justified, would be places where the originals are still readily available and not that expensive. K98K Mausers, to me. I see a weird number of people asking, like, I wish they made reproductions of those so I could get one. It's like, well, they're not actually that hard to get already. And anyway, ultimately, collecting is a very personal decision. You collect what interests you and what you want to have, and anyone else's opinion should really be secondary. So, like, if you want to go get a reproduction of a Luger, despite the fact that there's a massive number of Lugers out there already, then hey, you do you. Get one if it's what makes you happy. All right, and our last question comes from James. It says, does the amorality of guns ever bother you? Like, I find mechanics and history fascinating, and I'm not a pacifist. I think we should have a military with the equipment it needs to do its job. But sometimes the reality of what guns can be used for in the wrong hands gets to me. To be honest, no, that isn't something that I find specifically disturbing. I think all human tools are subject to misuse. We have all sorts of things that can do way more damage than guns. We have automobiles, we have nuclear power plants. All technology is fundamentally usable for both good and bad outcomes. And I don't think firearms specifically are a technology that we should eschew because of the potential negative uses of them. They've played a hugely important role in human history for good as well as for bad. And to be honest, no, it isn't something that bothers me. So hopefully you guys enjoyed these questions. Big thanks to all of the patrons for submitting those questions. If you would like to submit a question of your own for next month's Q&A, head over to patreon.com/forgottenweapons. Join up. You're going to help support Forgotten Weapons and the channel in the process, and I will put out a post usually about a week before I do a Q&A asking for questions. Thanks as well to Kiro for supporting Forgotten Weapons and sponsoring the Q&A videos. If you haven't tried their 100% malt rye whiskey, you should definitely give it a shot. If it's not available in your local liquor store, you can get it in some states through their online website. That's kirodistillery.com. Links in the description text below. And if you use the code ForgottenMalt10, you can get 10% off, and they'll kick some money back to me as well. So cheers. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.